essentially convert to another religion. Right, those we usually call in English apostates, known as mumarim or meshumadim in rabbinic language. And there, what I almost came to conclude is that, in a way, if taken alone as a statement of retroactively annulling a conversion, the idea of what Rabbi Sherman is doing is definitely kind of on the fringes of where the jurisprudence has been. If in some ways taken, though, as part of actually what's a complicated history of when we strip Jews of their Jewish identity, in a way, there is a sense in which it's a sort of kind of smaller, more controlled experiment of saying, and there's some very striking Haredi psak to this effect in contemporary Israel. Actually, someone who's born a Jew, but who really does not in any way adopt core Jewish practices, and certainly if they practice any other religious rites, they're actually not Jewish anymore, right? And if they would want to come back, they'd have to convert.
But let me comment on that, because it's an interesting question, or an interesting point. The type of ruling that Rabbi Tucker is now describing, in my opinion, in the history of Halakhah, is generally, would fall under the rubric of a chidush. It is really an innovation, because I'd like to say the following. The problem is, when you talk about issues of apostasy, actually classical rabbinic Judaism has no concept of apostasy, in my opinion, in a modern Western sense. In other words, apostasy means that you were part of a religion and you become something else. What Judaism does have, all of these notions to be a kofar, a mar, a meshumit, are various levels of heresy. There is a difference between being a heretic and becoming a member of another tradition. They are all forms of renewal in one sense or another, so that in classical halakha, as I would read it, there are punishments, in quotes, attached to, there are punishments attached to non-observance. Look, in the Shulchan Aruch, a famous law, if someone fails to observe Shabbat, that person is kagoy. That person is like a Gentile. In a world where all Jews observe Shabbat, for a Jew to violate the Sabbath meant that you were in effect a Gentile. But note, the ka is put in there like, because there is a problem. And here there is a book that I'd suggest that you look at, and I think it's a brilliant, brilliant chapter written by my teacher, Jacob Katz, in his book, Out of the Ghetto, Jewish Emancipation in Europe, 1770 to 1870. He has a brilliant, brilliant chapter called Conservatives in a Quandary. And conservative here doesn't mean conservative Jews. It means people like the followers of the Chatan Sofer. Here was their quandary. There's a lot of literature in the 1840s when the Reform movement first began. There were Hungarian Orthodox rabbis who suggested, let's define Reform and non-observant Jews as just being non-Jewish. The quandary that Professor Katz points to is that they were hoisted on their own petard because they were committed to Halakhah. And this is where you get the 2,000 years of Jewish jurisprudence, is the passage in Sanhedrin. A Jew, when a Jew sins, remains a Jew. They can be a kofar, they can be a meshumit, you don't let them in the minyan, you don't bury them in a Jewish cemetery, you don't allow their children to go to Jewish schools. But metaphysically, they are Jewish because Judaism has a birth dogma to take the stance that someone born of a Jewish mother is not theologically Jewish, runs completely counter to every source we have in rabbinic literature. It actually adopts a view of Judaism that views Judaism not in ethnic, but in completely religious categories, which, as you pointed out at the beginning, classical Judaism doesn't hold. The difference with the rabbis in Israel today, quite interestingly, is that the rabbis in Hungary in the 1840s simply didn't have the power to do what they wanted to do. The rabbis in Israel today, quite ironically, actually have political power because of coalition politics to issue these retroactive annulments, so that if you're one of these 15,000 people converted by Rabbi Druckmann, I mean, the cases don't come before the courts every day, but there's a potential that every person converted by him, their conversion could be retroactively annulled. That, by the way, and I was opposed to it for a variety of reasons, the Rokan bill wanted to prevent that, at least in terms of the state. The other issue is that what's interesting in Israel is the state gives these people legal authority. So the result is people who fall into these categories, if they fall astray of the rabbinate, actually cannot be married in the state of Israel and they're buried in a Jewish cemetery. It is hard to know when you've got 500,000 out of 5 million Jews falling into this category. I cannot believe that politically there's not going to be some kind of solution to this in some kind of way in the not too distant future.
Let's take some of your questions, please. Yeah.
Can you just stand up?
We'll take a few in a row, so we'll answer them.
I was just wondering about the case that you mentioned with the woman in England. As far as I understood it, academic people were talking about, her conversion under the rabbinate was deemed retroactively invalid by the London Beit Din on the basis of the fact that she subsequently went on to marry a Kohen. And so I was wondering about what the other kind of categories for retroactively deeming conversions invalid might be, halakhically. And then on the basis of that, you also mentioned that the reform movement can make rulings about halakhically what counts as a conversion. But I know there are lots of people in England, and I think it's probably true here as well, people who are kind of concerned about their status in the eyes of whatever the Beit Din they're living under is doing and is ruling on, and how should people approach that, especially given the retroactive conversion thing.
Right. Let's have a few more, please. Yes.
On the question of the retroactive, because this is just too fast.
I mean, it would be another whole issue, yeah.
So talk about, have the people who've made these decisions that yes, you can retroactively annul the conversions, have they spoken about the impact that might kind of result if these people who have converted have then had any kind of official role as a witness, as a rabbi, converting someone else? What happens to those people who, technically had no involvement, but
possibilities are actually endless.
I mean, have they anyway, I
okay.
No, great, fantastic. Let's go. We'll get two more in this round, and then we'll do another round. Yeah.
So a lot of the talk revolved around conversion and the problematic issue that it has in Israel, where politics gets in the way. But I wanted to know if you could talk about conversion within the United States, where politics doesn't get in the way, yet you still have reform, conservative, orthodox conversion, and all the conflict with that.
Right. Not the last one in this round, then we'll do another round. Yeah.
I'm going to take a surprising departure from the way I usually react to sort of paint a different picture so that this is a long-headed common question, that all of Orthodoxy in Israel is not, so to speak, conflated in the same portrayal. So that, for example, number one, to my knowledge, this particular Rav Sherman, his particular pronouncement, and I don't like the chief rabbinate, okay, but so supposedly was not accepted by the chief rabbinate, and in the end, Rav Amar, who's in charge of conversion, basically didn't tell him, I'm not accepting it, but in the end, power and court rulings ruled that, in fact, these conversions, would be accepted. Point one. Point two, and you know how I feel, there's a group of enlightened Orthodox rabbis called Rabbanei Sohar, from the word window, from Parshat Noah, who are totally looking at things, very differently. They are Orthodox, they're not conservative, they're not reformed, but they are much more enlightened in terms of trying to find different, approaches in Israel. In fact, one of them feels so strongly that in the election, that will be June or July in Israel, for the chief rabbinate, he himself will run for the chief rabbinate because he is disgusted with the status quo.
Right.
Third, even in this country, we're talking about sociologists and patterns. In this particular issue, I find myself, it's a little anomalous, in defense of Rav Moshe Feinstein versus some other Orthodox rabbis in this country, because in the case of the conversion, let me say it correctly, non-religious parents adopted a non-Jewish child and then raising that child in their non-observant home. If I am correct, Rav Moshe Feinstein definitely felt that that child was Jewish because he saw merit in an enlightened way that there would be potential for this child to somehow one day maybe recognize his Jewishness versus other, I could quote them, Yeshiva University rabbis who are not necessarily out there in the pale of Haredi who don't feel that same way. So that's just some anomalies. And I didn't, in the constellation of the description this evening, wanted to...
Just to regroup so we have all the pieces there. You got it. Fantastic. I got it written down. No, that's
Okay,
good.
so to go back, let me start with the young woman before. The issue with the Kohen, in the case of the London court, that was actually a different case than the Rabbi Goren case. That was actually a more recent one. There've been actually a couple in that regard. What that actually points to is the issue of, there is a line in the Mishnah Torah, in Hilchot Yisrei Bia, Sofo mochiach al tchilato. The way a person behaves in the end demonstrates what their intentionality was in the beginning. And that is one of the justifications, not the only, for retroactive annulment of conversion. I do want to indicate in the book, we spend very little time on it. I have elsewhere in my broad corpus written on this issue at much greater length. But the case in regard to the Kohen, what is still interesting here, for example, contrast that to someone like Rav Kook. Rav Kook is dealing with an individual, for example, in one case, where the wife wants to remarry. Actually, I don't remember now if it was the wife or husband, but the non-Jewish partner reverted to their original tradition. And I don't remember now if it was husband or wife. Rav Kook is asked, does a get need to be issued or can there be a remarriage? So in this case, it actually must be a non-Jewish man, is what I would imagine. A non-Jewish man becomes Jewish, converts back to his original religion. Rav Kook is asked, does a wife need a get from him? Rav Kook says yes. He doesn't countenance Rav Kook retroactive annulment of conversion, basing on the passage in Sanhedrin and also the passage in Yevamot. Once you convert, you convert. The fact is, there have been people in history who have engaged in retroactive annulment. It has never been posted with as much frequency as it has, I'm going to really say, in the last 20 to 30 years. By the way, sometimes these things were done with positive intent. The most famous case involved Rabbi Goren as well, with the Langer twins. There were, not twins, the brother and sister, Hanoch and Miriam Langer. How many of you know this case? I know it. That's what I Hanoch and Miriam Langer, there was a Mrs. Langer. Mrs. Langer had been married to a man, and I don't remember his name now, but I'm going to call him, for want of a better term, Mr. Polak, because he was Polish. He had converted to Judaism in World War II, and he had married Mrs. Langer, who was then Mrs. Polak. They were separated from one another during the war. She assumed he had died. She then married Mr. Langer. So what's the result of that? And then they have two children, Hanoch and Miriam. So that's perfectly all right. The husband's deceased. She's able to marry another man. They come then to Israel, and it turns out Mr. Polak shows up. So now what happens to Mrs. Langer? What category does she fall under now? Yeah, why are her children mamzerim? They are illegitimate.
She was technically still married.
She was still married to Mr. Polak, and therefore She was an agunah, chained woman who had no right to marry Mr. Langer. Now keep in mind, the only penalty for being a mamzer is that you're not permitted to marry, halakhically, another kosher Jew. I won't get into all the details of it, but I mean, a mamzer in Jewish law isn't illegitimacy in American law. Mamzer is someone born from an incestuous union or forbidden sexual union, or a child born from an eshet ish, an adulterous married woman. A single Jewish man has relations with a single woman, and a married Jewish man has relations with a single Jewish woman. That child is not illegitimate. If a single Jewish woman or a married Jewish woman has relations with anyone other than her husband, the children are illegitimate. Langers have no problem. Hanoch and Miriam grow up in Israel. They serve in the Israeli Defense Forces. They fall in love with two Israelis, and they're about to be engaged. Now, when Mr. Polak came on 3 different occasions, his Jewishness was confirmed by Batei Dinan in Israel. Now, fast forward to 1972. These children are about to get married. Most Israelis don't know anything about laws of conversion or mamzerut. They don't know anything about it. They do know that they've got 2 children who served in the Israeli Defense Forces, who've grown up in Israel, and suddenly they're not able to be married. The Rabbanut in Israel confirmed the conversion of Mr. Polak. There doesn't appear to be any way out of this. Rabbi Goren, and to this day we don't know who was on the Bet Din, convened a secret Bet Din. They took testimony against Mr. Polak, testifying to his non-observance. On the basis of that, Rabbi Goren retroactively annulled Mr. Polak's conversion. What does that do in terms of the children?
They're not Jewish, but they're not.
The children are not only Jewish, what are they no longer? They're no longer mamzerim because Mr. Polak never had a right. Ein kiddushin tosim. They were never married. By the way, the Israeli public greeted this with great enthusiasm. I was studying in Israel at the time. I still love, there was a headline in Yediot or something that I will never forget, where you have a Haredi rabbi. The headline is, Harav Goren Yoter Garua Me'Rav Reformi. Rabbi Goren is worse than a Reform rabbi. It made me think my own semicha had really been elevated in import, or what I was studying for. But leaving that aside, I want to point out, Rabbi Goren writes a long treatise on this. He says, these children came before me, and my heart was broken for them. He found a solution. By the way, Amnon Rubinstein, who was then the dean of Tel Aviv Law School, before he became, among other things, Attorney General of Israel, wrote an op-ed, probably in Haaretz, saying, this ruling is going to cause a lot of mischief. In other words, we're happy about the result, but now Rabbi Goren has put his imprimatur on retroactive annulment of conversion, and Pandora's been let out of the box, and who knows what the consequences will be. I wouldn't want to claim that Rabbi Sherman's ruling is based on Rabbi Goren, but there are other precedents. So the issue in regard to this is, once you begin to do this, you're right about the reasoning of it, but it is sofo mochiach al tchilato. What the person does in the end indicates they weren't sincere at the moment they converted. But keep in mind then that means every conversion is potentially challengeable. In regard to the issue then of reform conversion that you raised, this would be my own way of viewing it. This is just me personally. I think Reform and conservative rabbis need to engage in what I would call full disclosure. So, for example, this is what it generally means. If a Reform rabbi performs a conversion without Mila and Tevila, it means the conversion would be accepted by Reform and probably Reconstructionist rabbis. it would be accepted by some but not most conservative rabbis, and it would certainly not be accepted by Orthodox rabbis. A conservative rabbi ought to say, and I think every conservative rabbi I know does require, in my experience, these classical ritual acts of Mila and Tevila to be performed. By the way, I would say to someone, if I, as Reform rabbi, and my Bet Din is performing the conversion, even with women as witnesses on my Bet Din, if you undergo Mila and Tevila, all Reform, Reconstructionists, and most conservative rabbis will accept the conversion as valid. If I have male witnesses, all conservative rabbis will accept the conversion as valid, because the question of who is the rabbi isn't a major point. By the way, the Halakhah is also quite clear. You can have Shalosh Hedyotot. You can have 3 lay people. You don't need Musmachim for a conversion. I could get into that in a moment. Halakhah. But it just means that you should be honest with the people and say, look, if your children later get involved with more traditional people in the community, questions could arise. If a person converts with a conservative rabbi, in general, it means that, of course, in the whole non-Orthodox world, the conversion will be accepted as valid. No Orthodox rabbi, in principle, will accept the legitimacy of a conversion conducted by a conservative Bet Din. In praxis, I am sure there are tiny, tiny exceptions, but in general, they will not. And in general, most Orthodox rabbis will accept conversions conducted by Orthodox rabbis, except, if we want to talk about, except when they don't, is what I would say here. So that would be my answer to your question, and it means that people get to make these choices. By the way, I think Orthodox rabbis have every right to accept the legitimacy or validity of conversions that I would perform, and it doesn't, I'll speak only for myself, bother me in any way. It's a free country. Let people accept what they want. Let the people judge as they want. I do wish we could find overarching solutions in a modern world. I doubt that's possible for this kind of unity to emerge. I only resent it when the state favors one group over my group. That's my only taina. The second question dealt then with, have rabbis who've engaged in this bitula gerivah mafreya considered all the implications? I don't actually know. My sense is no, but I stand to be corrected, and you may have given me a topic for future research, but I'm not aware of it. In regard then to the United States, I'd respond in much the way I did to this young woman. Namely, I will tell you, speaking for myself, there are a couple of areas that would be problematic. I mean, one, keep in mind what I said before, most Orthodox rabbis, and we'll get to Rabbi Feinstein in a moment, but I would cite one psak of his in this regard. Go by the ruling of Rabbi Feinstein in regard to the legitimacy of non-Orthodox conversions. Rabbi Feinstein in 1950, and we do talk about this case, this is a famous case. By the way, Rabbi Isaac Klein, the leading halachic disciple of conservative Judaism for many years, in his book, A Guide to Jewish Religious Practice, when asked, does the conservative movement accept Reform conversions, cites this response that I'm about to describe in Rabbi Feinstein's Igrot Moshe Yoredea number 160, where he says Rabbi Feinstein doesn't accept our conversions, and I'll explain his reasoning in a moment, and we will not do that to our Reform colleagues. If Mila and Tevila are undergone in front of a Bet Din, we accept conversions conducted by Reform rabbis. That is the official ruling of the conservative movement in regard to conversions conducted by Reform rabbis where there's Mila and Tevila. Rabbi Feinstein is asked the following question. A woman is about to be buried in the Jewish cemetery of Canton, Ohio. This is in 1950. She had been converted to Judaism 32 years earlier in Canton. Her children had grown up in Canton. They had been bar mitzvah, married to Jews. It now came time for her to be buried. The Orthodox rabbi in Canton asks Rabbi Feinstein, can this woman be buried in a Jewish cemetery. What's the question? Why is the rabbi asking the question, and what needs to be determined?
Was the conversion legit?
Is the conversion legitimate? Rabbi Feinstein rules the conversion is not legitimate for 3 reasons. In fact, he says, Pashut HaGerut shall our rabbis, Reish Aleph Bet Yud Yud Samach. Well, that's the term he uses, rabbis, he spells it out, conservativer a no klum, for 3 reasons. One, he says, conservative rabbis, a non-yodim dinei gerut. They just don't know the laws of conversion. But then it's as if he says, well, you know what, most of them are ignoramuses. He doesn't use that term. Most of them, but he does say they don't know the laws of conversion. I don't know. Maybe Gordon Tucker does. I mean, it's a possibility. So he recognizes there could be a conservative rabbi who actually knows these sources. But then he says even if they know the sources, they're not observant. Their wives don't cover their heads. They drink stam yenam. They'll drink non-kosher wine. I mean, they're guilty of 1,000 averos. So it would be like saying, how can someone be a Supreme Court justice who says, there's some laws of the United States I don't want to observe. By the way, I'm saying this in one tone, but I want to indicate I think it's a principled stance on Rabbi Feinstein's part. But then he says, even if there is a conservative rabbi who is genuinely observant and who does know the laws of conversions, Pashut, Pshita, Shehashem Habazui Conservativer, the very, I don't know, how would you translate that? The shameful name, conservative, attached to someone testifies, and like 1,000 witnesses, Anam Sahade, we know in an a priori way that conservative Judaism is based on kafirah. It is based on apostasy, that Jewish law evolves and changes in history. It does not all come from Moses at Sinai. Consequently, no conversion conducted by a conservative rabbi can be accepted. I bring this up because I'm going to say that I have 2 problems with looking at unity on these issues. One is a practical problem. It is not possible that the Orthodox rabbinate will accept the validity of conversions conducted by non-Orthodox rabbis. It will be interesting for me as time goes on to see if rabbis, even from a yeshiva like Chovevei Torah, would accept the legitimacy in a de jure way. I am sure in some places there will be a de facto acceptance, but in a de jure way of conversions conducted by conservative colleagues. I do not know of any Orthodox rabbi who does that. Consequently, the only way to resolve this issue would be in effect for the Reform and conservative movements to dissolve themselves. But then I want to say on another level, well, I think that's true. I think on another level, there is another issue. And now I speak as someone who is passionately committed to gender equality. What if a proposal were put forward that for the sake of Jewish unity, we will create one standard bed din, and we talk about experiments in this, that will perform conversions for the entirety of the Jewish people and would allow people trained by Reform and conservative rabbis to convert as well, but there is one condition. A woman cannot serve on the bed din as a witness. I think, I'll speak now from my own posture, I do not think as a Reform rabbi I could possibly accept that. That would on a principled level be too high a price to pay, even for Jewish unity in this area. And I say this because it's possible even when you're liberal, doesn't happen often, and you try to be open-minded, to take your own side in an argument. But I do want to indicate, possible occasionally, but I do want to indicate that here the problem would be on the Reform and perhaps some of the conservative movement's side. In other words, the issue of gender equality would be a principle that would be so deeply challenged or so deeply held that there would be no surrendering it, even if the case of Jewish unity was at stake. And I guess what I would say is that sociologically it need not lead to the demise of of Jews working together because they might share Jewish faith, but I don't think in a modern world you're going to get complete accord on this, nor do you in Israel. Finally, in regard to Rabbi Twersky's point, I think in the book we draw a pretty broad spectrum of opinions, and if tonight I indicated that there was not a broad spectrum, for that I would apologize. I think there is a broad spectrum in the Orthodox world. Rabbanei Tzohar are an interesting phenomenon. Part of me applauds them tremendously, and another part recognizes that as open as they are, openness never includes accepting the legitimacy of the former conservative rabbis on these issues, but for the sake of the plight of Russian Jews in Israel, I'm not only quite sympathetic, I applaud what Rabbanei Tzohar do. I think on the issue of Rabbi Amar and Rabbi Sherman, I think there's a chapter that yet needs to be written. Well, I will tell you, at the end of this book, Danny and I, because we've delayed it 20 years, at one point, there's so many rulings coming out of Israel on conversion today. At one point, before we completed the book, we said, well, we should wait a little bit longer. And finally, I just said to Danny, you know what? In 20 years, all this literature will be out there, and someone will write a sequel to this book and be able to explore these issues in greater depth. There is variety in the Orthodox world. I think our book testifies to what that variety is. So in this sense, I would more or less agree with what you said. You want one last round?
Well,
So
I think
I just wanted to say, I know you feel that way, and I just wanted to point it out because I read the book very well.
I think I want to respect the time of folks here, and I know we said we'd do another round, but we have hit 9 o'clock. I'm sure Rabbi Ellenson will have to stay a few minutes after. I guess I would just say in closing, that, again, thank you for coming. But one of the things I encourage you, both through reading this book, but also learning more deeply on this topic, one of the things that to me is very rewarding and challenging about thinking about conversion is it forces you, by formulating your own thoughts on this topic, to actually define what is it that I think Judaism is about and actually stands for, and how do I actually then transparently formulate standards that I could defend, persuade, argue to someone else about the content of that community. If there's one thing that you take away from tonight, it's perhaps to take that deeper view, not just to think about the politics, how are we stringent, how are we lenient, how do we cut corners, not cut corners, but ideally, if this could be turned into a broader, substantive conversation in the Jewish community of what this is about, then maybe going back to that testy phrase before, that would be a machloket l'shem shamayim in some deeper sense.
Can I just
Please,
make
give you the
one
final
last
word.
comment? I mean, Danny and I are thinking about writing a follow-up book. And the follow-up book would be looking at...
Coming out in 2032.
I'm 65. I don't buy green bananas. I'm not quite anyway, with that said, we are thinking of doing a book where we would try to pick 20 or 30 responses, and on a variety of issues, not just conversion, and ask the question, and here we would look at rabbis from all denominations. What did their rulings say about their concept of Jewish people? Because I think you really would see it in their writings. The last thing that I would say, and I only want to say this because it's my favorite writing in all of Jewish tradition. My favorite writing is by a rabbi named Tzvi Hirsch Kalischer, who lived from 1795 to 1874. Because I just want to reflect what is my own view. Though I think in the book, and you'd have to tell me I think we're as descriptive as we can be. That's why I'm sorry about the word extremism, because I think it has other connotations. But in New Orleans in the 1860s, while the Civil War was raging, the Jews, as usual, always reflected on what was really most important, the Jewish status of children born to non-Jewish mothers. What I like about this the best is, you've just seen Lincoln, millions of people are being killed. But Jews in New Orleans are fighting, should a boy born to a non-Jewish mother and a Jewish father have a circumcision or not? So there's a rabbi named Rabbi Illaway, who had been ordained to Yeshiva Halakhah so fairly years now. There are 2 Moalim in the city. This is what modernity does. One Moal said, well, I can't convert these boys. They're born to a non-Jewish mother and a Jewish father. And the rabbi said, I can't do it. There's another Moal named Mr. Goldberger who says, what do I care what Rabbi Italy says? He has no power over me. Bring me your baby. I'll circumcise him. You can bring him to the mikveh and convert him to Judaism. That's what separation between religion and state means. But of all the rabbis to respond, Rabbi Kalischer was a Mavasir Tzion, a forerunner of Zionism, wrote the book Rishat Tzion, Seeking Zion in 1862, which was really the first work on Jewish religious Zionism. Said not only should these children be converted, but they are Zera Yisrael, they are Zera Kodesh. And in fact, Rabbi Ansalim's book today draws, among many sources, on Rabbi Kalischer's work. He says not only can you convert these children to Judaism, but they are Zera Kodesh, they are literally holy seed. And it is not only permitted to, it is a mitzvah to circumcise and bring these children into the Jewish fold. And he has 2 great lines that I've always loved. And I will say, as a teacher and a couple of people who have been my students at different times, I always try to keep this in mind when I teach. He says, what do you know about these babies? And in this great line he says, Mi yodea la yitzmachu mehen gedolei Yisrael. How do you know a great leader might spring from among these children? And I often will say to my students when I teach this line, how do you know who you're talking to? And what the impact of your teaching could ultimately be. And if you were to keep in mind Rabbi Kalischer's admonition here, not so much in regard to conversion, you might treat people differently than you otherwise might be inclined to do. And then he says in regard to the fathers, he said these fathers are sinners. He's an Orthodox rabbi. They have engaged in intermarriage. That is a sin. But he said, you know, in this case, they want to bring their children into the Jewish people. And he said, that's good. And then he has a line, Lifamim afilu poshei Yisrael osim mitzvot karanah. Sometimes even people who are sinners and do terrible things can perform good deeds that are as plentiful as the seeds in a pomegranate. And I just love that line because it means that each and every one of us as human beings do make mistakes, maybe even sins if you like that word. But people can also do great things, and the way in which you treat them may in the end have an impact on the direction they take. So many of them, thank you. It's always a pleasure to be with you. The issue is